What if the Bible you grew up with was only the version someone wanted you to have? What if, behind the familiar pages and chapter headings, there was a process, not accidental, not merely clerical, that selected some voices and set others aside? The claim in the title is sharp. An ancient process of selection shaped the Bible. But hear me carefully. That claim is not a simple conspiracy. It is an interpretive thesis grounded in historical events, debated by scholars, and charged with spiritual consequences. What I want to do with you now is walk through that thesis, expose what kinds of teachings were marginalized, and show you how the real treasure buried in those margins might be the treasure waking inside you. In the centuries after Jesus, Christianity did not look like a single uniform thing. Early followers scattered across different cultures, Jewish Christians in synagogue communities, Hellenistic thinkers steeped in philosophical schools, desert ascetics testing their souls under sun and sand, and groups we now label broadly as Gnostic, who read Scripture as a map for inner transformation. That diversity matters because it meant there were many ways to read Jesus and many ways to live after him. Into that plural landscape came a new set of pressures: imperial patronage, the need for organizational coherence, and the social realities of a growing church that wanted stability. Figures like Constantine and the councils that follow are often invoked in this story. Some of the decisions that shaped canonical boundaries came during moments when church leaders met in large councils to decide what texts and teachings were authoritative. Scholars continue to debate motives and pressures at work in those moments. Was the aim unity, institutional control, theological clarity? All of the above, perhaps, and none of them reducible to a single motive without oversimplifying a complex historical process. So what was left out, and why does it matter? Let me name two emblematic traditions that tell us a different Jesus, not one primarily as institutional head, but one who points to an inner way of knowing. First, the Gospel of Thomas. This is not a gospel that narrates a life the way Matthew or Luke does. Instead, it collects sayings attributed to Jesus, short, often enigmatic aphorisms. Saying 3 begins with a paradox. If those who lead you say, "Look, the kingdom is in the sky," then the birds will precede you. If they say, "It is in the sea," then the fish will precede you. Rather, the kingdom is within you, and it is outside you. Saying 70 puts the teaching bluntly. If you bring forth what is within you, what you have will save you. Read in their original context and with no modern gloss, these sayings invite a discovery of the divine as an inner knowing, what the Greek world called gnosis. Second, the Gospel of Mary. In the fragments we possess, Mary Magdalene appears as a charismatic interpreter who receives a private revelation and comforts frightened disciples with her insight. In these scenes, leadership is not simply hierarchical. Revelation is personal and experiential. For communities attuned to these writings, authority could flow from inner seeing as much as from an institutional title. I do not say this to denigrate the canonical Gospels, nor to claim that the Gospel of Thomas or Mary is superior. I say it because these texts reveal a persistent alternative in early Christianity, teachings that emphasize direct inner knowledge, personal awakening, and spiritual initiation over clerical mediation. It is one thing for a movement to promote consistent doctrine. It is another for particular voices and practices to be sidelined because they threatened a centralized model of authority. If you want to read fuller translations of the sayings I just mentioned, or see side-by-side comparisons of passages across the canonical and non-canonical texts, I have compiled a short ebook with primary source quotations and citations. You can download it from the Hidden Scrolls page linked in the description. It contains the sayings, translations, and notes on scholarly debate, so you can judge for yourself how these voices change the picture. Now, listen. If Jesus spoke in parables and aphorisms, it was not only to conceal truth from the unprepared. In many ancient teaching traditions, parables functioned as keys, sealed until the listener reached a condition of readiness. Consider the parable of the sower. On one level, it is a simple horticultural image. A sower scatters seed, and it falls on different types of soil: the hard path, the rocky place, the thorny patch, and good soil. Most sermons focus on the moral lesson: beware distractions, cultivate receptivity. But there is an esoteric reading that treats the parable as a map of interior states. The path represents hardened attention. Information hits, bounces off, nothing takes root. The rocky ground is the quick response without depth, enthusiasm before endurance, a flash of insight that withers because it never formed roots. The thorny ground is desire and worry. The good soil is the integrated heart where insight becomes living transformation. In this reading, the sower's seed is not merely doctrine, but the living word.
an energetic presence that awakens when conditions in the soul are ready. This is not to say the canonical exegesis is wrong. It is to say that Jesus' method can operate on multiple levels. Some audiences needed the moral mapping, others the initiation into inner transformation. That multiplicity is precisely why alternative sayings mattered, and why their marginalization had consequences. A version of Christianity consolidated that privileged external ordering and doctrinal uniformity, while interior experiential forms of Christianity were pushed to the margins or reframed as heresy.
If you've been moved by this so far, and you want the primary texts and a guided comparison of the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, and the canonical sayings, download the ebook I mentioned. The link is in the description. It will let you see for yourself how different emphases shift the portrait of Jesus. Let's shift now to a more unsettling interpretive strand, the retelling of Genesis and the figure of the serpent. In the common reading, the serpent is a tempter, a symbol of moral failure that leads humanity into exile. In many ancient contexts outside later Orthodox readings, the serpent can wear a different mask, that of wisdom, of the bearer of knowledge that awakens. This is not an academic endorsement of wrongdoing. It is an alternative symbolic language used by some early interpreters to re-envision the Eden event as an initiation. Gnostic cosmologies took this further, with the figure called the demiurge. The demiurge is not the ultimate source of everything, but a subordinate creator, a craftsman god, who fashions the visible world. In some Gnostic texts, the demiurge is depicted as jealous or ignorant, imposing rigid laws on the soul. In those accounts, the divine spark trapped in matter longs for return to the fullness beyond the demiurge's schema. These are complex mythic frameworks. When I say them aloud, I know these ideas unsettle Orthodox ears. They are alternative readings, interpretive lenses developed in particular historical contexts to make sense of suffering, law, and the experience of inner transcendence. Why mention this? Because when Scripture presents a God who sometimes seems wrathful and law-centered, and when Jesus turns and speaks of intimacy, mercy, and an inward kingdom, a question is generated. Are we encountering a single, uncomplicated portrait, or have different layers and metaphors been woven together over time? Some readers hear a dissonance and interpret it as evidence of competing theological imaginations. Others read it as development within a single unfolding revelation. Both approaches are part of serious theological conversation. Take as an example the juxtaposition between certain Old Testament legal texts that emphasize retributive justice and petitions for the settlement of communal life, and Jesus' famous injunction to love enemies and turn the other cheek. The tension is real, yet to draw a radical conclusion that there are two gods is to overstate. It risks creating a false bifurcation. A more measured claim is this: different strands of religious thought emphasize different aspects of divine character. Some readings center justice and order, others stress intimacy and inner transformation. This is why the marginalization of ecstatic and inner-focused texts matters. It narrows the theological imagination towards institutional stability.
There is a kernel here that touches what many of us feel, a longing for a more immediate encounter with God, for practices that awaken rather than merely instruct. For those drawn to the Gnostic and contemplative streams, the meaning of Jesus' death and resurrection is less a forensic transaction and more an interior alchemy. Let me explain what I mean by alchemy, not as material pseudoscience, but as a spiritual metaphor found across many esoteric traditions. Alchemical language divides the spiritual process into three broad stages: nigredo, albedo, and rubedo. Nigredo is the blackening, the dissolution, the death of old structures, egoic identifications collapsing. Albedo is the whitening, purification, the clarification that follows the breakdown. Patterns are washed and seen with new light. Rubedo is the reddening, integration, illumination, the emergence of a new life. Read the Passion in these terms as an esoteric interpretation rather than a historical report. The arrest, the descent into the darkness of crucifixion becomes the nigredo, the confronting of death in the soul. The burial and the silent time is the albedo, where subterranean purification occurs. The resurrection is the rubedo, a kind of inner rebirth that transforms the one who knows it. This is not to replace doctrinal claims about atonement or to offer a universal gloss that fits every believer. It is instead an invitation. What if the crucifixion and resurrection are patterns you can trace in your own life? Losses that felt like death, the slow, painful clearing of what no longer serves, then moments when life returns, but renewed and deeper. Many mystical traditions, Christian, Jewish, and beyond, testify to precisely this movement. If you feel a stir reading this, you are not alone. Many seekers discover that the scriptures hold layers: communal law and prophetic justice, personal ethics and inner initiation, institutional structure, and immediate communion. The presence of multiple voices in the early centuries meant there were many paths by which the Christian message was embodied. Over time, a set of texts and forms of authority became dominant. That dominance served many needs: social order, doctrinal clarity, survival in a political world, but it also narrowed the range of acceptable spiritual expression. So what was hidden, in practical terms? Not necessarily a secret manual that negated the rest of Scripture, but a set of practices and readings that emphasized direct experience. Sayings that encouraged you to look inward, accounts that elevated women as leaders and revelators, images that reframed exile and law as stages in spiritual initiation rather than mere moral failure. Those emphases were not erased overnight, nor were they entirely extinguished. They survived in the desert traditions, in certain monastic practices, and in whispering lineages that preserved inner teachings.
But the public, institutional face of Christianity shaped the canonical narrative, and in that shaping, some tendencies were made marginal. This brings me closer to you now, because this is not only a lecture in church history, it is an invitation. The phrase, "the hidden scroll," is useful precisely because it is a metaphor, something written but buried, waiting to be read again. The title we began with, "The Ancient Society That Edited the Bible," can be understood less as an accusation against people who were bad, and more as a description of historical dynamics, institutional actors making choices, publicly and privately, about which voices to promote and which to marginalize. Those choices had consequences for how people understood authority, revelation, and the spiritual life. If you're listening and something inside you leans toward this idea, that there is an inner scripture, a living word to be discovered within, then allow me to guide you through a brief practice. This is not a miraculous formula. It is a short exercise to help you feel whether the inward posture Jesus sometimes points to might be accessible to you. Place your hand lightly over your heart. If you can, close your eyes. Breathe slowly. Inhale through the nose for a count of 4, hold for 2, exhale for 6. Do this 3 times. As you breathe, soften around whatever restlessness is present. Allow the surface thoughts to be background noise, and invite a quieter listening. Say silently, or aloud if you prefer, this simple affirmation: "Reveal what is hidden. Show me what I have yet to see." Say it once, and then sit in silence for a few breaths. Notice any image, feeling, or word that arises. No need to judge it. Let the quiet be its own teacher. This brief practice is an enactment of the Gospel of Thomas's invitation to bring forth what is within you. It is a small experiment in the claim that the living word is not only on pages, but also lodged in your flesh and attention. If nothing dramatic happens, and often nothing dramatic does, that is perfectly fine. The point is not performance. The point is posture, an interior availability that over time shapes how you read texts, how you respond to authority, and how you discern truth. Remember the caveats that frame our whole conversation. Where I've described processes of selection, I have labeled them as contested and interpreted. When I speak of Gnostic readings or alchemical metaphors, I am offering lenses, not replacing creeds. The story of Scripture is complex, and the motives of particular actors in history are multi-layered. The aim here is not to provoke rebellion against every institution. Many institutions preserve good and holy things, but to invite a rebalancing, a recovery of inner modes of access to the divine that complement communal structures.
If this material has shifted something inside you, and if you want deeper keys, primary texts, comparative translations, and a guided path for integrating these inward practices with your existing spiritual life, then join the private circle linked below. In that space, we provide source texts, contextual notes, and guided meditations designed to help you read both the book and the living word inside you.
That link in the description leads to a community where we study together and hold one another accountable, not to a flashy promise, but to steady practice. Before we close, let me reframe the title once more, because the final thought must be both a challenge and a comfort. The ancient processes that shaped the Bible did indeed consolidate certain voices and quiet others. That is part of human history. Systems preserve what they need to survive. But what they hid was not a final secret locked away from posterity. The teachings they marginalized, the insistence on inner awakening, the recognition of direct revelation, the celebration of leadership that arises from experience rather than title, these things did not vanish. They became living currents beneath and alongside the institutional river. The startling thing is this: what was hidden inside the book is the same pattern that can be found inside your own heart. When you read a parable as a map, when you feel a saying settle as a living presence, when you walk the stages of inner transformation and find yourself altered, you participate in the recovery of that buried scroll. You are not simply inheriting texts. You are being invited into a tradition of awakening that has never been wholly extinguished. So leave with this. Approach Scripture with courage and curiosity. Honor the communal story that shaped the canon. At the same time, cultivate the discipline of inner listening that reads Scripture as a living conversation rather than a closed statement. Allow both the public witness of the church and the private witness of the heart to teach you. In that balanced way, the hidden becomes revealed, not as a scandal, but as a restoration. If this message landed in you, if it stirred a question or a recognition, subscribe to stay connected. Join the private circle to receive the ebook and the guided practices. Share this with someone who is searching, not to unsettle them, but to open a door into a fuller, more adult faith that can hold complexity. The ancient editors made choices. History recorded them. Now the work is to read with eyes that seek both the book and the living word. What they hid inside the Bible is waking. It begins in you.